Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer 40k lore. And today, we are going to have a look at one of the bestest races in 40k, because it's the closest thing you're going to get to Skaven in the 41st millennium, the Stryxis. Granted, their visual appearance is more that of skinned dogs with far too many eyes and ugly claws, but hey, details, it is the spirit of the creature that matters, and their spirit is most definitively one with the horned rats, although perhaps in a slightly more convivial sense. The Stryxis will not necessarily kill you and take all of your stuff, they will merely consider it at any given opportunity. You see, the Stryxis have developed a society, quote-unquote, heavily focused around deceit, backstabbing, and the possession of vast quantities of slaves. But, on the bright side, this wonderful-sounding society is primarily based upon the idea of unrestrained capitalism. Oh. Though to be fair, they have a slightly different interpretation of this particular idea than we might. The Stryxis think that absolutely everything has some form of value. However, what that value might be is not necessarily tied to anything in particular. They might consider worthless baubles to be priceless treasures, and they might consider priceless treasures to be worthless baubles. And there appears to be very little in the way of codes or rules as to what is a worthless bauble and what is a priceless treasure. In fact, the two seem to switch places rather frequently, and in all due likelihood has more to do with the inner workings of Stryxis society than the strictly speaking monetary value of the actual item. Though I hasten to add that the Stryxis themselves see absolutely no value whatsoever in abstract or conceptual sources of value. In other words, beyond a coin being pretty, they see precisely dick all value in actual money. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that they won't trade in it. The Stryxis will trade in quite literally anything and everything, but when they trade for money, they do not see the monetary value of the actual cash. They don't think that a $100 bill is a $100 bill and therefore worth $100. They simply see it as yet another item to be traded for something else. And if their trading partners just so happen to put a premium price on a piece of paper due to the numbers scrawled on it, then that's just all the better, isn't it? And it is all because, at the end of the day, the Stryxis are not so much mere merchants or traders, or even collectors. They simply have a near-compulsive relationship with the act of trading and haggling in and of itself. This is why their entire society, as much as we know about it, is based upon the intricacies of trade and power. Basically, the better a member of their society is at trading and tricking their opponent, quote-unquote, out of their own valuables whilst giving up, in their own terms, relatively little, bearing in mind this is all based on their own subjective interpretation of value, the higher his status within their society is. And you also need to bear in mind that the Stryxis have a rather loose definition of the term trading. As far as they are concerned, attacking a weaker opponent and stealing all of their stuff at gunpoint is a form of trade, in which the Stryxian raider is trading ammunition, time, and potentially manpower in return for taking whatever they can from the people they are attacking. As far as the Stryxis are concerned, it's still a trade, it's just that we might disagree with that particular definition. To fully understand this, you need to realize that to the Stryxians, absolutely everything is a form of transaction. Just a simple conversation is a potential transaction. Any form of communication, even if it is an imperial ship issuing a warning that they are about to fire upon the Stryxians, is a potential transaction in waiting. And again, the potential goals and gains are, well, more or less up to the Stryxians in question, really, and how they might be able to spin it to other of their own kind. For example, let us say that a particular caravan of Stryxians are not allowed in a particular area of space. They might consider negotiating access to this area to be a win. They might not have anything they're interested in actually doing in that area, but merely knowing that it is a place they were not in previously, and that they managed to negotiate access to, is in their mind a victory. And then of course it comes to placing a value upon said victory, bearing in mind once again the greater value one can achieve, the greater one's status within their society. The Stryxian might make the argument that simply having access to the area might open up a near limitless range of possible further trades. Of course, this might be a somewhat problematic narrative to sell if it is simply an empty void of space, in which case the Stryxian might try something else, like it could be a future smuggling route, or a place perhaps to sit in wait for weaker convoys, upon whose arrival they can initiate a more vicious form of negotiation. And this, of course, leads us to one of the most valuable things of all within Stryxian society, and indeed most societies: knowledge. Because whilst trading mere items have relatively predictable outcomes, if you trade a bunch of weapons to a pirate faction, they're going to be raiding a specific area. If you trade a bunch of food to a specific faction, they're probably going to eat it. There are of course considerably more complicated transactions as well, such as multiple links where you trade a thing for another thing for another thing to finally get the thing you actually want, etc. But generally speaking, once you're trading one object for another, the end result is relatively easy to predict. However, when you're trading information, the sky is quite literally the limit, since information can be quite literally anything, and, bearing in mind the most important factor, said information does not necessarily have to be true. And indeed, a good lie can often be worth a hell of a lot more than the truth, although the Stryxians do have some form of code. They will lie, but they will lie in such a manner that it is not necessarily a lie, because after all truly good lies have a core of truth to them. Let us take a somewhat simplistic example. You are dealing with a Stryxian. He wants your handgun. In return for your handgun, he is going to give you a valuable gem. And when you ask him why he would be willing to trade such a clearly precious item for such a relatively common item, the merchant will simply tell you that by doing this trade, he will be able to make an even better trade down the line. So you hand over your handgun, and he, true to his word, hands you the precious gem. Then he points the handgun back at you and asks for the return of the precious gem. True to his word, once again, trading the gem for the handgun has allowed him to get an even better trade down the line, where now he has both a handgun and a precious gem. Now, of course, this is an overly simplistic example, but it serves to illustrate what the Stryxis might consider a perfect trade to look like. Since not only has the Stryxis' position been strengthened, and he has acquired several items which he considered to be of great value, in fact in this case, as demonstrated, he would consider the pistol to be of even greater value than the precious gem, meaning that he has not merely increased his value, he has probably doubled or even tripled it as far as Stryxis' society is concerned, since of course the value of any given object is determined by what you can turn it into, rather than necessarily the conceptual value of the object. And as the icing on top of the cake, the trade also included some form of trick and/or subterfuge, further increasing the value of the trade, since the Stryxis in question was also able to use knowledge and information as a part of it. This does, however, not necessarily mean that the Stryxis are inherently untrustworthy. Well, they are, but they aren't. It's a strange little mix. On one hand, if they see even the faintest possibility of fucking you out of everything you own, they will happily do so, and they will see absolutely nothing wrong in doing so. In fact, they will consider it to be the honourable thing to do. However, as long as you are in a position where you are not bargaining away your leverage, be that some form of valuable item they want, knowledge, or indeed a loaded gun, then they will, in all due likelihood, remain entirely faithful and loyal to the stipulations of your deal. Just bear in mind the precise stipulations of said deal. Let us take yet another fairly simplistic example. You might come across a Stryxis convoy, a so-called Quebec. This is how the Stryxians travel through the galaxy. They take tons of ships, and they chain them together, with literal chains, hundreds of them, and then the lead ship, depending on the size of the convoy, is the one with the engines blaring, pulling this improvised caravan across the stars. Let us say that this convoy has a particularly large and particularly powerful imperial warship involved in it. Now, as far as Stryxis are concerned, it's a dead hulk. It doesn't have any engines, it doesn't really have any power to it, and they can't be bothered repairing it, because as far as they're concerned, the reward for doing so is not worth the immediate expenditure. But to a loyal servant of the Imperium, like an entrepreneuring rogue trader or inquisitive inquisitor, it might be very, very valuable indeed, since they might have access to the resources to fully restore this vessel back to fighting shape. So you engage the Stryxis in a negotiation. They will of course try to weasel as much out of you as scavenly possible, but assuming a successful conclusion to the negotiations, they will more than happily hand over the ship in return for whatever they asked for in return. However, if you didn't specify that you wanted fuel with the ship, they're not going to give you any. If you didn't specify that you wanted the ship with everything that was currently on it, they will completely strip it before handing it over, etc, etc, etc. And to further complicate the deal, the Stryxis might not be able to agree with you on what parts of a ship are and are not valuable. For example, a loyal servant of the Imperium might consider its massive weapon batteries and rows upon rows of lance weapons to be the primary asset of the vessel, whilst the Stryxians might consider the captain's chair to be the premier item on sale. And whilst this might again seem rather random, and in fact most would view this as completely goddamn random, that is not necessarily the truth. You see, the Stryxis, although they often make up their own values more or less on the spot, do often have certain reasons for why they put value on certain objects. For example, in the case of the captain's chair, they might view that as a symbol of authority, and since they don't quite understand why it is a symbol of authority, and that its authority is lent to it by the person who sits in it, they might simply attribute the authority to the chair itself. Therefore, the chair must give authority to whoever sits in it, ergo, the chair itself is valuable. This can also be illustrated by their habit of trading family members. They know that Imperials, generally speaking, place a fairly high value on friends and family. They don't understand why. Most of their families are vat-grown clones, or even just slaves. Stryxians place virtually no value whatsoever on family. But the strange little bipeds with the Aquillas love their families. Ergo, a family member, to them, has a lot of value. And so, in the case of Stryxian society, where family members have practically no value, this sounds like a fantastic deal. Since family members intrinsically have value, the way the Stryxians see it anyways, offering to trade one of their family members would be fantastic, because they don't give a shit, and yet apparently the people they are trading with place considerable value on family members. As you can see, they've kind of missed the point, since of course the reason why you value your family is because they are your family, not simply because they are a member of a family. This serves as a perfect example of how the Stryxians will attempt to understand the value structures of other species, so as to be able to trade with them more effectively, yet they don't quite understand their logic, and so a trade that might sound entirely irrational to us might actually to them sound entirely logical. It's just that we simply cannot understand one another's mindset. Another wonderful example of this might be how we handle information. For a loyal servant of the Imperium, it would be no skin off their nose to tell a Stryxian where they are from, which planet they hail from, and the history of the Imperium. Whilst to a Stryxian, divulging any kind of information as to their potential homeworld and their overall history would be considered to be virtually unthinkable, proving that there are things that even the Stryxians will not deal in, as of course secrets in and of themselves also do have a certain value. Personally, my theory is that the Stryxians had their original homeworld somewhere near the Eye of Terror. Specifically, I think they used to be a spacefaring, relatively normal civilization around about the time that the Eldar decided it was a good idea to worship anal sex and excess, which eventually gave birth to Slaanesh. I suspect that the Stryxis' homeworld were one of many engulfed in that utter catastrophe, which might explain why the Stryxis absolutely despise despise the Eldar. They hate them to such a degree that they will literally drop anything and everything they are currently doing, including valuable negotiations, to hunt after even the merest hint of Eldar presence. While Stryxians are by nature cowardly creatures and would only ever consider attacking somebody if they had a considerable advantage and something was to be gained from it, they will quite literally throw themselves at the Eldar even if they think they have little chance of actually winning. Now, of course, they prefer setting things up to the point where they can actually win, and they prefer even more so to get others to do their dirty work for them, obviously, but if these things are not possible, the Stryxians have absolutely no reservations whatsoever to attack the Eldar at even the slightest hint of an opportunity. There is also a rather curious thing about them. You see, the Stryxians are of course slave masters extraordinaire. They like enslaving all manners of wonderful creatures. Humans, Kroot, Tau, Orcs, Goblins, Gretchens, whatever they can get their hands on. Of course, within certain limitations. Enslaving an Orc, for example, is usually more bother than it's worth, but it can be fun to have one around as an exotic style of pet, for example. However, they never enslave the Eldar. They seem to, whenever they can, simply kill them out of hand, which could also hint at yet another transaction. Since the Stryxis have absolutely no problems whatsoever dealing with Chaos Worshippers, they might determine that since Slaanesh put such an absolute premium on Eldar souls, that liberating said souls from their fleshy prisons might be a trade in and of itself. Normally, I would put it beyond even the most entrepreneuring of trade species to get a deal directly with the literal devil, in this case Slaanesh, but the Stryxis? I'm not so sure. In fact, I don't even think I'd be particularly surprised if it was revealed that the Stryxis have somehow set up a pay-as-they-go plan with Slaanesh where they receive goodies in return for soul stones. Oh, and whilst we are more or less on the topic of slavery, the Stryxis are of course very, very fond of their meat, which is of course the way in which they lovingly refer to their slave population. In certain convoys, the slaves can outnumber the Stryxis by more than 3 to 1, and considering that the majority of Stryxis are vat-grown clones, used for little more than manual labour and shock troops, that is a rather frightening proportion. But, of course, the Stryxian overlords are kind and gentle masters, treating their slaves with all of the love and respect they deserve, which means they only beat them infrequently and only torture them when they do something wrong. I mean, come on, they are noble and gentle overlords, yes, but failure cannot be tolerated. And generally speaking, failure is relatively rare, as it can be disincentivized by selecting one amongst the slaves' numbers at random to demonstrate the consequences of said failures upon. The Stryxis also employ a couple of different devices to keep their meat in neat and tidy order, one of which is the claw collar. This is shaped a little bit like a Stryxis hand, a most unfortunate claw-like appendage that wraps around the slave's neck. The collar can then be coaxed into increasing the pressure upon the meat's neck for short intervals in case the meat is in danger of having thoughts of his own, for example, or some such other rebellious behavior, or occasionally just to remind said slave that it is indeed possible to make the collar tighter. If the creature is large enough to perhaps remove said collar if it was to inconvenience it, the more effective bomb collar might be utilized, which is once again the good old-fashioned application of a small explosive device to the back of the neck. And in the case of even more vicious and violent aliens, an excruciating device might be planted within the creature's own brain. This is a fascinating little piece of electrical knowledge that will send excruciatingly powerful jolts of electrical energy into the brain stem of the creature in question. These lovingly administered doses of electricity are designed to directly stimulate the brain's pain center, or in the case of a handful of species, make a brand new pain center and then utilize that instead. This might, at first glance, sound somewhat cruel and unusual, but remember that despite all of these minor inconveniences, living aboard a Stryxian slave vessel is still in most cases better than living in an imperial underhive, so, you know, every cloud has a silver lining in all that. And I'm not kidding, the Stryxis are, relatively speaking, fairly nice slave overlords, since they view all of their slaves as, at least in some way, precious commodities. They will not mistreat them or kill them without a reason. Now, of course, they might come up with a reason if you displease them sufficiently, but generally speaking, they will not be cuntish merely for the sake of being cuntish. Though, with that being said, occasionally, there is an actual tangible benefit to acting like a complete and utter arsewipe on occasion. Any good slave master knows the value of making an unmistakable example of one of the more rebellious elements of one's lower castes. One would of course endeavour to find an excuse to carry out the example, but in the case that one is not found in time or a suitable one cannot be located, then the simple reason of stating an example will be enough. Hell, the sheer random nature of it all might in and of itself be also used as a discouraging measure. And speaking of masters, there are quite a few masters within Stryxis society. Generally speaking, it refers to somebody who is in command of a certain subset of a caravan, or even the overall leader of a caravan. Alternatively, it could also refer to somebody that has specialized themselves in a given field. For example, in one case, there could be several masters within one Quebec caravan of ships, but they are specialized in certain things. One of them could be a slave master, the other could be a trade master, and the third could be a vat master. In this case, you would have one specialized in keeping the slave population under control, one specialized in external dealings with other creatures found across the galaxy, and one specialized in growing new and fascinating life forms to be utilized in a wide variety of tasks. It is relatively rare to have as many as 3 masters within the same convoy, since of course the masters will constantly be scheming and manipulating one another, which usually leads to these positions being somewhat impermanent, shall we say. But as with all things within Stryxis society, there is a simple loss versus gain equation. If the convoy as a whole would benefit more from having 3 specialized masters than it would from having 1 overall master, then the convoy will have 3 specialist masters. At the very least until one of them decides that the convoy is no longer best served by having 3 bosses. Particularly successful masters within their given field might also command their own highly specialized convoys, which have been designed to carry out a very specialized task. For example, the convoy of a Vatmaster might contain vast bulk trader vessels filled to the brim with Vat technology, allowing them to grow vast quantities of new and interesting creatures. They might also possess specialized equipment for growing particularly large and vicious new organisms. Whilst the convoy of a Raider Master might contain vast quantities of hangar spaces from which to launch raiders. Since the Stryxis, once again being at heart a cowardly species, prefer to strike from ambush, they place great value on utilizing large quantities of light strikecraft, which will be manned by expendable Vat servants and also slaves. Once an enemy vessel has been duly crippled, it will simply be flooded by slaves and Vat-grown experiments until the vessel has been suitably cleansed for the looting to begin. And speaking of looting, obviously if you simply destroy the vessel and everything aboard, there will not be a whole lot to loot. This is where the technological masters of the Stryxis come into play. They have created a vast array of new and interesting weaponry. Some of it is relatively basic, essentially the equivalent of Imperial Guard las weaponry, although a little bit less powerful, known as light rifles and light pistols. Some of these weapons, however, are capable of continuous firing, e.g. the firing of beams, which, as you can probably imagine, is rather useful in the cramped confines of a starship. They also utilize a wide variety of other weapons, either traded for or acquired by some other means, which are then handed to various slave soldiers or Vat-grown fighters. But beyond these somewhat more normal weapons, they also have so-called ether weapons. These are rather strange little things, as they apparently have some sort of connection to the warp and ethereal energy. However, the powers of a Psyker appears to be completely anathema to them, and if exposed to a Psyker's aura, they will simply cease to function. And if they are exposed to a blank, they are likely to simply be destroyed outright. This quite clearly means that these weapons are clearly somewhat psychic in nature, but not necessarily purely psychic in nature, or the Stryxis might even be tapping into some form of unknown warp energy that the rest of the various civilized races in the galaxy have yet to fully discover. After all, within the warp, anything and everything is possible. It is entirely possible, if not even perhaps likely, that the Stryxis have managed to convince themselves that they have created some form of specialized weaponry that is capable of, for example, passing straight through a starship's hull, including walls and even flesh and bone, whilst doing absolutely no damage, but, on occasion, doing damage. Confusing, I know, but essentially the idea is that an ether blade, for example, would pass right through your clothes, your armor, your skin, and even your blood vessels, etc., but somehow sever your soul from the body. No damage would actually be caused to you, but you would undoubtedly be very, very dead. They even have weapons like these on a ship-level scale. This is one of the few things that the Stryxis are rather peculiar about. They do not utilize the weapons of other species, be they las cannons or macro cannons or anything like that. Instead, they use their own specialized cannons, created from this ether technology. They are capable of flooding portions of enemy ships with what is described as a light grey fog, that when it touches anybody, they simply just collapse, stone dead, without so much as a single mark on their bodies. Presumably, they have their literal spirit stolen from them, and presumably cast screaming and butt-naked right into the warp, which would make it one of the shittiest way of dying in the entire 41st millennium. And this is not the only piece of peculiar technology that the Stryxis possess. Whilst they tend to keep their own technology very, very secretive, preferring to trade in the technology of others, they do possess some rather considerable pieces of technological engineering themselves. For example, they are apparently capable of traveling through the warp, although nobody really knows why. They have a certain aversion to psychers, so that doesn't seem particularly likely. They also have an ability to cloak their ships in a phaser field, which, by some sources apparently, literally removes portions of the ship from reality, which certainly sounds rather dodgy. They also possess real space engine technology that is of an unknown make and origin. They do not seem to correlate to the ships in question. For example, once a large convoy has been spotted, the convoy appears to be traveling at a speed that was considerably higher than what the lead vessel should be able to produce, at least in the cases where a convoy has been spotted being led by an imperial vessel, and said vessel's power signature and engine can be positively identified, meaning that the Stryxis have in all due likelihood found some way of either boosting the effectiveness of the engine or perhaps some kind of warp magic-y nonsense to simply suspend some of the laws of physics around said vessel. They also have a nasty habit of being able to tell exactly what manner of vessels are nearby and exactly what is on board said vessels without the vessels in question having the faintest fucking clue that they are currently being scanned, which is augur technology that would be far beyond the abilities of the Imperium to replicate. But then again, the Stryxis' spirit animals are of course the Skaven, which we all know have a long and proud tradition of making up all kinds of nonsensical and superpowered technology, so I guess it isn't really that strange at all. But, of course, nothing is ever a constant when it comes to the Stryxians. They might have access to incredible technology allowing them to propel their Quebecs across space at blinding speed. They might be able to traverse the warp in ways we can barely even dream about. They might have incredible weaponry, or their ragtag bunch of caravan vessels linked together by chains could be a combination of ancient-ass derelicts, barely operational with leaks all over the place, using good old-fashioned centrifugal force to replicate gravity, and being barely held together by duct tape and sheer blind luck. Nothing is ever quite what it seems with these dog-faced Xenos monstrosities, and that's why I love them so much. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching. Please do consider liking and sharing the video around if you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.